50 years ago, 57,450 UN troops lost their lives defending South Korea. Now BBC Two remembers forgotten heroes.
The Imjin River, Korea, scene of one of the most celebrated last stands in military history. On the 22nd of April 1951, British troops defending the hills above the river were waiting. Somewhere to the north, unseen, a massive Chinese army was heading towards them. Just before midnight, a ferocious four-day battle began. This bloody encounter would be a crucial turning point in the Korean War.
I don't think anybody's prepared for anything like that.
Very loud bugles blowing, the Chinese screaming their heads off. Pandemonium, really.
Against all odds, this isolated force defied China's mighty spring offensive.
I'd never seen so many troops in all my life. The hillside was literally covered in them.
One prayed desperately that we would survive. One prayed for oneself, one prayed for the others.
The ordeal did not end on the Imjin. For those taken prisoner, a different war began. Against communist brainwashing in Chinese POW camps. The extraordinary heroism of these soldiers became legendary. But like the events of the Korean War itself, their sacrifice has slowly faded from memory. 50 years on, the veterans of a forgotten war remember their finest hour. In October 1950, the different battalions which made up the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade left for war-torn Korea. They were joining a United Nations force defending the South. Britain was still recovering from the Second World War. Nobody wanted to know about war in a faraway place called Korea. Nobody wanted their sons and husbands to fight again after only 5 years of peace. But Army Chaplain Sam Davies was convinced that Britain should support the United Nations call to resist the invasion of the South by communist North Korea.
Chaplains are not people who bless guns or anything like that. But I still felt United Nations was doing the right thing in trying to defend South Korea from the wanton invasion by the communist powers.
Short of manpower, the brigade had to call up World War II veterans. For these reservists with young families and new jobs, leaving meant only heartache. Trooper Dennis Wybrow was a radio operator on the tanks.
I mean, I'd just been out about 4 years, and I've got a young family and everything. Everything was just beginning to settle in, you know. Got work and things like that, and the more or less the bottom dropped out of my world, really.
Young officers like Lieutenant Mervyn McCord, however, just couldn't wait.
The Second World War had not been over all that long, and I think youngsters of my age, our major concern was that it might be all over before we got there and gave us a chance to do our bit.
For 20-year-old Corporal Derek Hurst, the first challenge was to find Korea on the map.
I had no idea where Korea was until I looked at the map. I don't think anybody had any idea where it was until they looked at the map. A long time ago. And, yeah, we found it.
with a strange sounding name.
We were setting out on a great adventure, and we were going to travel through the Mediterranean, down the Suez Canal, and it all was very exciting.
Seeing dolphins or porpoises, whatever they were, in the Indian Ocean from one horizon to the other. Thousands of them. Lovely.
During the 6 weeks it took the brigade to reach Korea, there was a dramatic turnaround in the war. Successful UN counterattacks were pushing the communists back north, right up to the Chinese border. So by the time the brigade arrived in early November, there was even talk that they might be back home by Christmas. But as the 29th Brigade headed up to the front, there came ominous news. A new enemy was appearing in the hills to the north. Here, Chinese reconnaissance units were caught infiltrating across the border. This threat of Chinese intervention spelt an end to any hopes of an early return home. 26-year-old Anthony Farrah Hockley was then adjutant to the Gloucesters.
There'd been some counterattacks in the north, and amongst the people captured were some Chinese soldiers. Now, at that point, I can say, I thought, and I said to one or two of my chums, I don't altogether like the sound of this. It's one thing to be battling with the remnant of the North Korean forces. With the Chinese forces, with the huge numbers that were involved, we were in for a very different war.
Farrah Hockley was right to be concerned. On the 20th of November, over 300,000 troops of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army stormed over the border to support the North Koreans. These Chinese troops were disciplined, brave and experienced, almost immune to hardship. The Chinese quickly pushed the largely American force south again, a headlong retreat watched by the advancing 29th Brigade. A witness to this chaos was medical orderly Derek Hurst.
Well, there was lots of vehicles going down the road heading south, you know. One place we stopped and we were brewing up, and this American GMC truck pulled off the road, and this is a big cloud of dust. He says, "Hey, you guys want to get the hell out of here. The sounds of goddamn chinks coming down this road." Everybody's heading south, like a panic almost about it.
The UN troops then began to suffer terribly as temperatures dropped to record levels, 40 degrees below. Harry Gledden had suffered extreme heat during the jungle warfare of the Second World War. Now in Korea, he experienced the other extreme.
It was so cold it used to nearly paralyse you, especially when that Siberian wind blew down from the Korean peninsula. We were so cold, we moved like little old men. And we felt like little old men as well. It was so cold it got through to your bones.
As the Chinese paused to regroup, the main enemy was now the terrible Korean winter. By New Year 1951, the brigade was dug in just north of the South Korean capital, Seoul. Intense pressure was being put on China's leader Mao Zedong to stop the fighting. Some American hawks were even suggesting using atomic weapons to resolve the conflict. Yet, despite the real danger of a Third World War, Mao ordered his generals to attack again. As the brigade came face to face with the Chinese, Mervyn McCord, fighting with the Royal Ulster Rifles, finally got his first taste of combat.
I can still remember.
Mervyn McCord, fighting with the Royal Ulster Rifles, finally got his first taste of combat.
I can still remember one's reaction when one saw one or two people, and you knew if it wasn't them, it was you. And I can to this day still remember the first one, the startled look on his face as he... But you soon get over that.
You killed him?
Yeah. Quite a lot of them. I mean, it was either they killed us or we killed them. And, I mean, there were lots and lots and lots of them.
For bravery during this winter fighting, Mervyn McCord was awarded the Military Cross. The new offensive by the Chinese created panic amongst desperate Korean civilians. Seeing how this war could shatter the lives of the innocent was a profound shock to Chaplain Sam Davies.
A lot of people left North Korea to flee south while they had the opportunity. So one saw these wretched people, women and children, walking with their bundles on their backs. The sight of refugees is always pitiful, always. And we saw that, and that impressed me very much. You just hoped and prayed that they would come through safely.
Many refugees did not survive. A witness to this was 21-year-old Captain Guy Temple of the Gloucesters.
A number of babies were frozen to death, and I saw those being thrown into the river. One then realized about war and its awfulness.
As winter turned to spring, the 29th Brigade resumed their march north towards the Imjin River. During this advance, Sam Davies had his first experience of combat.
I remember going up in company with the doctor and the medical team, behind the troops going up, and we knew in the valley below there were Centurion tanks who were also shelling above us. One was always hoping and praying that they wouldn't fall short and fall on us. One shocking thing I always remember is seeing a Chinese soldier leaning forward over his bunker, dead of course, but it's as though his skull had been scooped out from behind. It was like an empty eggshell in a way. I suppose blown out by the force of artillery.
Here, Derek Hurst learned how to deal with the brigade's dead and dying.
There was one casualty brought into us, and he was very badly wounded. And it was fairly obvious. I got the ammo to have a look at him, and without him saying, he just said, "No." And he said, "Shall I be all right, Loft?" to me. And I said, "Oh, I think so, yeah." I said, "I'll give you some morphine." I said, "And you wake up in Japan, and there'll be a little Japanese girl there looking after you." And a few minutes later, he was dead. I won't describe his injuries because his mother might be watching. But it was pretty horrific.
By April 1950, the now battle-hardened 29th Brigade was on the 38th parallel, taking up defensive positions overlooking the Imjin River. The Imjin and its surrounding hills had always been the historic invasion route from the north. A breakthrough here would guarantee a rapid advance to the capital, Seoul. The UN expected the weight of China's spring offensive to be concentrated at this vital point. British patrols were sent north across the river to seek them out, but they found nothing of any danger. On the other side of the river, veteran Chinese commander Peng Dehuai was playing a waiting game. He was holding his divisions back, out of sight. Marshal Peng knew his men could march rapidly, at least 20 miles, straight into battle. By Sunday, the 22nd of April, small numbers of Chinese scouts had been seen. But it was considered safe enough for Sam Davies to give communion to the men.
I had no feeling in my mind at the time that these young people I was giving communion to would, some of them would be killed within a few hours. It was just a very plain, simple service of Holy Communion.
That evening, Peng finally ordered his men to advance towards the Imjin. At the same time, the commander of the Gloucesters, Colonel Khan, sent a battle patrol back down to the river. It was led by Guy Temple, who had an order to retreat if his men encountered a force of more than 30 Chinese.
I took 16 men, 3 Bren guns and a 2-inch mortar and a lot of ammunition. I asked Lance Corporal Patrick to put a 2-inch mortar illuminating flare up, which he did. And then we saw the Chinese in the water. Well, it was 100, and then at the end, well, I would have thought it had to be something like 3 battalions. They were thick in the water. So it means about 3 battalions, probably 700 men in a battalion, you know, somewhere around about 2,000 men in the water. It was an astonishing target. That's how we saw it. And we did use all our ammunition.
Throughout this first moonlit night, more Chinese continued to pour across the river. Every forward position of the brigade opened fire. The Battle of the Imjin River had begun.
Very loud bugles blowing, the Chinese screaming their heads off, fireworks going off, rockets going off, and very light pistols going off, and flares and everything. It's a pandemonium, really.
Marshal Peng committed 40,000 troops alone against the brigade. Elsewhere along the 170-mile front line, American and other UN troops were facing similar human wave attacks. For Peng, it was make or break. He needed to smash the UN quickly to succeed. On the Imjin, the first of many acts of valor would soon take place. During this first night of the battle, A Company of the Gloucesters had been under constant attack. One of their officers was a young lieutenant called Philip Curtis. Curtis had gone to Korea just after the death of his wife from TB. Fellow officer Jeff Costello remembers his grief.
He didn't care whether he lived or died, and he didn't really care if he had any more life. I think that was his... if you got deep down with Phil, that's really what applied. That's really what applied.
Early morning on the second day, Curtis led a counter-attack on a Chinese machine gun post, pouring down fire on his men. On his first attempt to knock it out, Curtis was badly wounded.
They sought cover on the folds of the hill and so on. One of his corporals said to him, "Sir, very soon one of the medics will be here to give you to see to your wound." But Philip Curtis said no, he would go on.
He then decided he was going to attack it by himself. Attempts were made to dissuade him, but he said he was going, and then an extraordinary thing happened. He ran out from the wire, threw a grenade. The grenade was in the air. Before it hit the ground, he was riddled with bullets and killed. The grenade then fell on the men in the machine gun position and knocked it out.
For this extraordinary act of bravery, Philip Curtis was awarded the Victoria Cross. He was just 24 years old.
I mean, it requires uncommon gallantry to do that. People receive decorations for acting beyond the line of duty, to doing things that you could hardly ask them to do because it would be beyond whatever duty they owed. That was beyond the line of duty.
Also decorated was Jeff Costello, whose gallantry won him the Military Cross.
They tried to come up my hill several times. I had a grenade thrown at one stage which landed just close to me. It was only one of those things that make your face black. They're like a blast more than any shrapnel or anything like that.
To blunt the Chinese attacks, Jeff Costello's platoon deployed all their formidable firepower.
Several of their assaults just broke up because you can imagine the force of five Bren guns with one loose on the side. That's 30 rounds, that's 150 rounds all in one spurt in the space of seconds. I saw an awful lot of dead Chinese.
Whilst the Gloucesters defended the left flank of the battlefield, the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers on the right were also bearing the brunt of the Chinese offensive.
There was a company called Z Company, and there was fighting all night on this mountain, and it was slaughter, and we had to go and get them off this. They were surrounded by Chinese, and we had to go, our company, Y Company, had to go and rescue them more or less. But we had to leave all the dead behind, but we got all the wounded out and the other men. And there was one chap called Major Wynne, and he was covered in blood. He'd been wounded 3 times, and his uniform was stiff and caked with blood. And as he fell off the hill, one of our chaps said to him, "Be careful, sir, there's some snipers on the way down." And he said, "What does one more matter?" He got the DSO for that.
On this second day, the men of the Royal Ulster Rifles were called up to hold the line on the right flank. Marching into combat for the first time was a national serviceman, 20-year-old John Dyer.
I'd never seen so many troops in all my life. The hillside was literally covered in them. If you can imagine, if you've ever seen on a film, when the lemmings go over a cliff, it was just like that. Then we realised that we were into trouble. I mean, we wouldn't be human if we hadn't got scared. I mean, a mass of people rushing at you, bayonets fixed, grenades being thrown, shouting, screaming, because they used it as a fear tactic, you see.
Day 3 of the battle saw savage fighting continue all along the UN front line. Peng's hope of a swift breakthrough was now fading. The commander of the 29th Brigade, Brigadier Brodie, contacted his American superior in the UN to ask how he might further deploy his men. Brodie could report that heavy casualties were being inflicted, but the brigade was now outnumbered 8-1. They were stranded with Chinese in, around and behind them. Yet any hopes of relief were then dashed by an American misunderstanding of British understatement.
British brigadier reports his position. The American commander responds. The British, being asked, "How are things with you, brigadier?" said, "Well, they're a bit sticky here, sir," expecting the divisional commander to realise that if he said that, it was pretty difficult for him. But the American divisional commander thought that meant we're having rough and tumble here, but we're holding. If it had been an American there, he'd have said, "Sir, there is all hell breaking loose here." The two nations spoke militarily in a slightly different way.
Without the promise of further support, Colonel Khan of the Gloucesters decided to fall back to a peak known in Korean as Solma Ri, later known as Gloucester Hill. Here the Gloucesters would make their last stand.
I remember our battalion doctor said to me, "Padre, can you carry as many bandages and medical equipment as you can?" Which I gladly did, of course. And in the moonlight, it's a picture of scrambling, panting men going up this very steep hill. Everyone knew that the Chinese would probably start a night attack, and that we'd be very lucky to survive that.
We then heard this eerie sound of the Chinese bugles, which are not strident, if you like European bugles are. I wouldn't say they're melodious either. They're haunting, sad. Colonel Khan, I think, sort of heard this for about 5 or 10 minutes, and he said, "Right, we must clearly do better than that."
The Colonel and I were talking about these bugles. He said, "It's a long time before I'll want to hear a cavalry trumpet," which is what it sounded like, again. I said to him, "Well, should we not perhaps send some bugle calls back?" He said, "Good idea, let's do that." I called down the side of the hill, "Drum Major, have you got your bugle?" "Sir." He, of course, silly question, he always had his bugle with him. I said, "Well, play some tunes to discountenance the Chinese. What shall I play?" I said, "Play everything." So Butts, who was a great big tall man, fine man, stood up in the darkness on the side of the hill and played everything from Reveille to Lights Out. It did stop the Chinese playing the bugles for about an hour.
The Chinese made 7 furious attempts to wipe out the few hundred remaining Gloucesters, now isolated and encircled on the upper slopes.
Bear in mind that I was commanding the remnants of a company holding that position. They were around 400 or 500. We were down to about 40 by that stage. And the last fire I called for was the napalm, and that actually knocked out the remainder of the people anyway for the time being.
By dawn on the 4th day of the battle, the brigade's ammunition and medical supplies were dangerously low. There was little food and water. Soldiers had barely slept for 72 hours. Casualties were mounting. Orders were finally given to break out.
When on the morning of the 25th...
To break out.
When on the morning of the 25th we had received an order that the battalion was to try and make its own way out, hoping that in a large number of people pulling out, some would succeed. I felt it was probably the only thing that could be done. That meant leaving our sick and wounded, which our medical officer said he could not leave. He and the medics and the padre decided to stay with the sick and wounded, which was a brave thing for them to do and a selfless thing for them to do.
As the Gloucesters began their own escape, attempts were made to help the brigade's other forward positions. John Martin had only arrived on the Imjin the previous evening with his friend Dickie Tamblin. As last-minute reinforcements for the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, their orders were to resupply the battalion's weakened positions.
We set off through the entrance of the valley, and we were literally, from the word go, we were literally like a race course. We were literally flat out. Carriers were bouncing, very rough road. And we were having to hook our legs and hands into the ammunition boxes to hang on. I saw flashes of tracer going over our heads, and that was the crack of the shells exploding on the hillside beside us. And when I turned around again, Dickie was slumped over, and the back of his head was blown off, and he slowly tipped over to one side, fell onto the exhaust grills. I remember thinking to myself very clearly, and it's lived with me ever since, I'm glad it wasn't me. And a terrible thing to say and think, but it just seemed automatic. I'm just glad it wasn't me.
Days of stubborn resistance had bought the UN precious time. They had saved Seoul. Now these men had to save themselves.
At that point, we had no choice. We were told, you're in a hopeless situation. While there's still a gap in the valley, come out. Come out as, not as regiments, not as companies, come out as sections, which is 5 or 6 men at a time.
With time running out, the tanks of the 8th King Irish Royal Hussars were given the rescue order. They were told to race up the valley towards the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers and Royal Ulster Rifles and get them out. On this rescue column was Dennis Wybrow.
We've got to make a road up there and try and get the infantry out. That was more or less a death of glory sort of stunt.
As John Dyer descended from the hills with the Chinese at his heels, he was relieved to see the tanks.
We were told the only way you're going to get out is come out with us. So as we climbed up onto the tank, I was pulling my mate up. He was knocked off. I don't know what happened to him. As I was climbing onto the tank, a Chinaman tried to pull me off. So what did I do? Everything else was up on the tank. You put your rifle up, then you climb up afterwards. So I just booted him. He got a military boot straight in his face. That made him let go.
The courageous Chinese became suicidal in their ferocity as they saw the tanks taking the survivors back down the valley.
The tanks were going straight through them. And that's all I could hear was these people screaming, being crushed by the tanks as they went through them. Quite a horrible experience.
It was only when John Dyer's tank finally reached safety that the full horror of what had happened became clear.
It was just a mess. Just a mess. The sides of the tank was covered in blood. All the tracks was all full of limbs. It was a mess. It was a mess. Actually, so much so that we were taken off into the tent so that we wouldn't see any more of it. But it was a horrible mess.
The medics tried their best for those who escaped this valley of death.
They jumped on the tanks for a ride out, and of course they really did concentrated the targets for the Chinese to shoot at, I suppose, hadn't they? And we started lifting the casualties off, and we were having to put dead to one side and doing what we could with the living. We were getting ricochet wounds and all sorts of things where the bullets had bounced off the sides of the tank and gone through. It was a very strange feeling, that was, dealing with them.
During this fourth and last day of the battle, the Chinese finally succeeded in taking Gloucester Hill. Sam Davies waited for the end.
We all stood there with our hands raised. Mercifully, no shots were fired. There was a fleeting thought we might have been just mown down, but no. And we had to place our hands on our heads. The young Chinese officer said, you will go down the hill with your hands on your heads. Any movement and you can be shot. And so we set off, the doctor and I, the remains of the medical staff, and helping several of the walking wounded, the very badly wounded, and those who were dying, we couldn't, they had to be left.
Farrah Hockley tried to find a way out of this trap, but he too was forced to surrender.
It was a very shameful moment, surrendering. I hated doing it. Surrendering seemed to go against everything that I thought soldiering should be about.
In the confusion after the battle, those who had escaped from the hills had no idea who was missing, who was dead, who had been taken prisoner.
And the next morning they had a roll call. You had to give a report to anybody you knew who'd been killed, and all the details were all written down by the officer.
Every now and again you hear, sir, but most of the time you were getting killed, sir, missing, sir, killed, sir. And it seemed that the ones that were left, there was a lot more missing and killed than we had left standing there. I mean, when I looked along the line of what was left, it didn't seem very much.
More than 500 British soldiers were taken prisoner on the Imjin. The Chinese photographed them, eager to show the world the defeat they saw written on these exhausted faces. They were then marched over the Imjin River, deep into North Korea.
That was a very long march, of course. We didn't get to the prison camps until November of that year, most of us. We were all already very tired. We'd had very little to eat. We were getting more and more tired, of course. Some people dropped out, some were just shot by the guards and left to die.
But the Chinese had paid a heavy price too. Many were taken prisoner. On the Imjin alone, 10,000 Chinese troops had been killed. Having failed to make the breakthrough, Marshal Peng withdrew his battered army north again. This was a turning point in the war. Never again would the Chinese attempt an offensive of this kind and threaten South Korea. The UN was now able to create a yet stronger defensive line back on the river. The return to the Imjin also allowed the British dead to be identified. A more dignified burial would follow, with personal effects sent back to loved ones at home.
There were our blokes what were dead up there, and we got to dig them up, identify them. So the volunteers, I asked for volunteers, so we went up. There's a big bond, you build up a bond between blokes, don't you? Comradeship, isn't it? You don't like to let anybody down. I mean, you were pals with them when they were alive, you're not going to be frightened of them when they're dead. That's the way I looked at things.
With the dead buried, the brigade's thoughts turned to comrades who had been taken prisoner and disappeared into North Korea. Their own long march to the POW camps would be an exhausting 400 miles. Once in the camps, the Chinese wanted recruits for their own vision of a world revolution.
We will re-educate you, and you will learn what the truth about this war is. We will not harm you if you obey our rules and regulations. But you will learn with us. That was our first hint of the famous lenient policy. We would have every right to kill you as war criminals, but we know you are dupes and tools of the Western imperialist powers. We are going to re-educate you and give you a chance to learn the truth. Therefore, because of that, we will be lenient and spare your lives. That was our first indication of the great process of indoctrination that went on in the prison camps. The total attempt by the Chinese to give us the teaching of Marxism, Leninism, and if possible to convert us to the point of view and to the ideal of the ultimate dictatorship of the proletariat.
It was all in that sort of attitude of we were naughty boys and we'd been given another chance and we'd got to buck our ideas up and get down to realising how to lead a moral life. And if we did that, all would be well with us. If it didn't, then they would be tough with us.
The Chinese released photographs of happy, contented inmates. But behind this propaganda was something far darker. Prisoners died of disease and malnutrition, and punishment for those seen as reactionaries could be cruel. Colonel Khan of the Gloucesters suffered beatings and solitary confinement for 2 years. Only 46 out of 622 Gloucesters escaped Gloucester Hill. The few returned to the UK as heroes.
It's not very hard to imagine the feelings of the men of the Gloucesters reaching Southampton aboard the Empire Foy. And here are the men who survived and escaped from that Imjin River battle, less than a score of them. They added glory to the great traditions of their regiment and the British Army.
The last stand of these glorious Gloucesters caught the imagination of the British public. But other soldiers returning from the horrors of Korea felt ignored.
When I came home, no welcoming party, no nothing. I came off the train and I had about 3 miles to walk to my home, which was out in the country. And I happened to meet one of my old schoolmates. He said, "Oh, hello, John." He said, "You look nice and fit. You've been on your holidays?" I said, "On my holidays?" "Yes." "So you put that." I said, "I've been around the other side of the world." I said, "We've been out in Korea for a year." "Where's that?" "Never heard of it."
Nobody wanted to know. "Oh, you were in Korea, were you?" That was about as far as it got. Nobody wanted to know. Of course, he'd already had the Second World War, which was quite an exciting time, and more directly involved with it, with bombing and one thing and another. And people were sick of wars, they didn't want to know about wars.
In July 1953, news reached the camps that the fighting in Korea had ended. An armistice was signed in a new demilitarized zone back on the 38th parallel. Part of this agreement was a prisoner exchange. One of those prisoners swapped was Guy Temple. During his captivity, he had had a gun put to his head with the threat of execution after an escape attempt. Now, with the other POWs, Guy was going home.
As we went across the bridge, the first thing we knew we were on the right side of the line was when we saw this sergeant military police. You saw that red cap and you thought, wow, yes, that's it. And I remember one or two of the soldiers gave him a hug and a kiss, which he was probably unused to. And we went on. And, you know, one's heard all this business of walking on air, but that was exactly how it was, walking on air.
By November 1953, all the prisoners were finally back home.
We'll gather lilacs in the spring again and walk together down an English lane until our hearts have learned to sing again. When you come home once more.
Yes, when I saw my wife, it was wonderful. We put our arms around each other on the dock at Southampton. And I just felt I'd like to spend the rest of the day holding her like that. And then the next and perhaps an emotional moment was seeing my son, who hadn't seen me for 2.5 years and really didn't know who I was. And so I cooled it. I said, hello, something like that, without many embraces and so on. I knew he didn't know who I was, except he guessed because I was with his mother. His mother had said she was coming down to meet me. I said yes. I said, hello, old chap, and I just shook his hand.
You and I will soon forget our care and pain and find the
Returning with his men was Colonel Khan of the Gloucesters, coming home to receive the Victoria Cross for his brave leadership, but still with a fierce pride in his men.
The majority of them, I think, have done extraordinarily well under very difficult circumstances. It has been a strange experience, and I'm very proud of the way that they've come out of it. They are all just about as keen as I am, I think, to get away to their homes. And I think that all of us very soon will have forgotten this particular experience.
Half a century after the battle on the Imjin River, Koreans cannot forget. Their country is still divided. A demilitarized zone still separates the communist north from the south. Every year on Memorial Day, school children lay flowers on the graves of the 57,450 UN troops who lost their lives defending South Korea. Here are the graves and the names of the 400 British dead and missing on the Imjin. Their comrades who survived have also not forgotten. On this 50th anniversary, they ask that we remember too.
Many faces come to mind, and it's quite right that we should commemorate their lying there, as it were, as a perpetual reminder to us that there were various bills to be paid for countering aggression, and they paid the full whack.
It's unfair that so many men should be killed, and so many men should go out there and fight and put their life on the line, fighting for the principles of the United Nations, not to be remembered. It is unfair, but you can't help human nature, can you? If people don't want to remember it, they won't. The British soldiers that went out there and fought, and they've got something to hold their head up for. They can be proud of what they did out there. And I'm only sorry that everybody couldn't come back, but wars don't happen like that.